Hello, this is Lecture 4 that will introduce you to the US economy by providing a historical overview and brief analysis of the current state of affairs. The workings of the US economy are complex and often mysterious, even to economists. At its simplest, the economy runs on three major sectors: consumers, businesses, and government. Consumers earn money and exchange much of it for goods and services from businesses. These businesses use the money to produce more goods and services and to pay wages to their employees. Both consumers and businesses fund the government sector, which spends and transfers money back into the system. The banking system plays a crucial role in the economy by providing the means for all sectors to save and borrow money. Finally, there are the stock markets, which allow consumers to invest their money in the nation's businesses, an enterprise that further fuels economic growth for all sectors. Thus, the US economy is a circular system based on interdependent relationships in which massive amounts of money change hands. The historical developments that produced this system are important to understand because they provide key information about what has made the US economy such a powerful force in the world. The term market economy describes an economy in which the forces of supply and demand dictate the way in which goods and resources are allocated and what prices will be set. The opposite of a market economy is a planned economy, in which the government determines what will be produced and what prices will be charged. In a market economy, producers anticipate what products the market will be interested in and at what price. And they make decisions about what products they will bring to the market and how these products will be produced and priced. Market economies foster competition among businesses, which typically leads to lower prices and is generally considered beneficial for both workers and consumers. By contrast, a planned economy is directed by a central government that has a far greater degree of influence over prices and production, as well as a tighter regulation of industries and manufacturing procedures. The United States has a mixed economy, which combines aspects of a market economy with some central planning and control to create a system with a high degree of market freedom, along with regulatory agencies and social programs that promote the public welfare. The mixed economy did not develop overnight. It has evolved over more than 2 centuries and has been shaped by American experiences at various times with hardship, war, peace, and prosperity. So let's speak about the historical trends and start with the Colonial Times. When European colonists first came to the New World, they found a vast expanse of land inhabited by Native Americans. Many of the first colonies were business ventures called charter companies that were financed by wealthy English businessmen and landowners. The colonies were granted limited economic and political rights by the King of England. After profits proved to be disappointing, many of the investors turned over the companies to the colonists themselves. These actions were to have far-reaching consequences on the shape of the United States. Christopher Kant and Albert Carr note in the book which is called The US Economy that the colonists were left to build their own lives, their own communities, and their own economy. At first, the colonists were preoccupied with merely surviving, but eventually they engaged in commerce with Europe by exploiting the natural resources of their new homeland. The main agricultural products of the colonies were tobacco, wheat, rye, barley, rice, and indigo plant. Other important exports were animal furs, products from fish and whales, and timber. Shipbuilding became a major industry in New England. Frustrated with the political and economic interference of England, the colonists banded together to forge a new nation, the United States of America. The push for independence from Britain, which culminated in the Revolutionary War, was driven by economic and political motivations, including the desire for greater self-governance and tax relief. In 1776, a book published in England would have long-reaching effects on the new United States. The Scottish philosopher Adam Smith wrote a book called An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. The book was remarkable for many reasons. It discussed economic principles in a common sense, non-mathematical manner, and argued that the forces of supply and demand affect prices and wages. The book criticized the restrictions and regulations common in European countries, and it advocated free and open trade within and between countries, and the abolishment of wage and price controls. Adam Smith believed that an invisible hand was guiding workers seeking to better their private finances, which in turn helped nations achieve prosperity. In other words, people who work hard for their own gain unconsciously contribute to national wealth. The principles of a competitive marketplace with little government interference were adopted by the United States and dominated the nation's economic policy for more than a century. During the late 1700s, Britain and the newly formed United States underwent a major social and economic change from agriculture to industry. The Industrial Revolution saw the production of the steam engine, the cotton gin, and other machines capable of increasing production while decreasing human labor. Farming, in particular, became much less labor-intensive, freeing up people to pursue other forms of employment. Over the next century, the United States changed from an agrarian-based nation to one in which the majority of income was generated by manufacturing, trade, and business providing services to consumers. The 1800s were a period of enormous growth for the United States in terms of territory, population, and economic might. The Northeast developed thriving industries, and cities swelled with hundreds of thousands of European immigrants. Even though the South remained largely rural and agricultural, mechanical innovations such as the cotton gin generated the region's focus. Cotton became a major crop and was exported to textile mills in the north and also overseas. Much of the economic success of the South was based on the use of slave labor. Deep divisions arose between factions in the North and South on the morality of slavery and associated political and economic issues, which led to the devastating American Civil War in 1861. By the time the war ended in 1865, the factories of the Northeast had become extremely important in fueling the US economy. In 1873, the American author Mark Twain co-wrote with his neighbor Charles Dudley Warner the novel called The Gilded Age, which describes an American society in which unscrupulous businessmen and corrupt politicians pursue quick fortunes at the expense of the common people. Indeed, the decades following the Civil War were characterized by scandals involving high-level politicians making money from crooked business deals and by an unprecedented boom in business. The resulting social atmosphere was one of decadence among the upper classes contrasted with poverty and labor unrest among the lower classes. The US government had a hands-off approach to business regulation, a tactic described by the French term laissez-faire, which means do as you please. It was generally believed that the government should not interfere in economic affairs, but should instead allow supply and demand and competition to operate unfettered, resulting in a free market. The Gilded Age is notable for a growth in corporations. A corporation is a legally defined entity that may receive financial support from many investors, but is treated as an individual under the law. A corporation is granted a state charter, including specific rights, privileges, and liabilities. This type of business organization became very popular in the US in the late 1800s. It allowed people to invest in businesses without taking on all the responsibilities and risks of being a business owner. Some charters limited the liability of individual investors, who were paid dividends in proportion to the share of investment in the corporation. Some corporations grew through mergers or by buying out the companies of their competitors. Then they developed a business structure called a trust, in which the component companies were managed by a small group of people called a board of trustees. These corporations controlled nearly all the business in their respective industries, a condition known as monopolization. The public feared that trusts squelched competition that helped keep prices in check. In 1890, Congress passed the Sherman Anti-Trust Act. Its stated purpose was to protect trade and commerce against unlawful restraints and monopolies. However, due to court challenges, the law was not successfully applied until the early 1900s. In economic terms, a panic is a widespread occurrence of public anxiety about financial affairs. People lose confidence in banks and investments and want to hold on to their money instead of spending it. This can lead to a severe downturn or even depression in the economic condition of a nation. The US economy suffered from panics and depressions even during the booming growth of the 1800s and early 1900s. Economists argue about the exact definitions of panics and depressions, but in general, it is agreed that panics and/or economic downturns occurred in the United States in 1819, 1837, 1857, 1869, 1873, 1893, and 1907. The crises were triggered by a variety of factors. Common problems included too much borrowing and speculation by investors and poor oversight of banks by the federal government. Speculation is the buying of assets on the hope that they will greatly increase in value in the future. During the 1800s, many speculators borrowed money from banks to buy land. Huge demand caused land prices to increase dramatically, often above what the land was actually worth in the market. Poorly regulated banks extended too much credit to speculators and to each other. When a large bank failed, there was a domino effect through the industry, which caused other banks and businesses to fail. A panic or depression results in a downward economic spiral in which individuals and businesses are afraid to make new investments. People rush to pull their money from banks. As panic spreads, banks demand that borrowers pay back money, but borrowers may lack the funds to do so. Consumers are reluctant to spend money, which negatively affects businesses. Demand for products goes down, and prices must be lowered to move merchandise off the shelves. This means less profit for business owners. Businesses lay off employees to cut costs and do not hire new employees. As more people become unemployed or fearful about their jobs, there is even less spending in the marketplace, which leads to more business cutbacks and so on and so forth. The cycle continues until some compelling change takes place to nudge the economy back into a positive direction. The early 20th century was a time of social and political change in the United States. Public disgust at the corruption and greed of the Gilded Age encouraged the movement which is called progressivism. Progressives promoted civic responsibility, workers' rights, consumer protection, political and tax reform, trust busting, and strong government action to achieve social improvements. The progressive era greatly affected the U.S. economy because of its focus on improving working conditions for average Americans. Successes for the progressives included child labor restrictions, improved working conditions in factories, compensation funds for injured workers, a growth surge in labor unions, federal regulation of food and drug industries, and the formation of the Federal Trade Commission to oversee business practices. Some people viewed the progressive movement as an attack on capitalism and a prelude to socialism. The U.S. economy was first described as capitalist by the German economist Karl Marx, who used the term to describe an economy in which a small group of people control the capital, or money, available for investment, and by extension, control the power within the country. A common criticism of capitalism was that it favored profits over the well-being of people, of workers generally. Marx advocated a socialist system in which wealth and property were not held by a few individuals, but were equally distributed among all workers under a heavily planned economy. The socialist movement gained some momentum during the progressive era, thanks in large to its ties to organized labor. In the book called The Tyranny of Change, America in the Progressive Era, John Whiteclay Chambers II states that during the 1912 presidential election, the socialist candidate Eugene Debs garnered more than 900,000 votes, which is around 6% of the popular vote. However, socialism soon faded as a serious challenge to US capitalism. Despite its laissez-faire attitude, the federal government took two actions in 1913 that were to have long-lasting effects on the US economy. The first is the establishment of the Federal Reserve System to serve as the nation's central bank, to furnish currency and to supervise banking. The second is ratification of the 16th Amendment to the US Constitution, authorizing the collection of income taxes. World War I erupted in Europe in August 1914. The United States entered the conflict in April 1917 and was engaged until the war ended in November 1918. Even though the nation spent only 19 months at war, the US economy underwent major changes during this period. It is sometimes said that war is good for the economy, because during a major war, the federal government spends large amounts of money on weapons and machinery through contracts with private industries. These industries hire more employees, which reduces unemployment and puts more money into the hands of consumers to spend in the marketplace. This benefits other businesses not directly involved in the war effort. On the surface, these economic effects appear to be quite positive. However, major wars almost always result in high inflation rates. Inflation is an economic condition in which the purchasing power of money goes down because of price increases in goods and services. For example, if a nation experiences an inflation rate of, let's say, 3% in a year, an item that can cost $1 at the beginning of the year will cost $1.03 at the end of the year. Inflation causes the value of a dollar to go down over the course of the year. In general, small increases in inflation occur over time in every healthy growing economy, because demand slightly outpaces supply. Economists consider an inflation of 3% or less a year to be tolerable. During a major war, the supply and demand ratio becomes distorted. This occurs when the nation produces huge amounts of war goods and far fewer consumer goods, such as food, clothing, and cars. This lack of supply and anxiety about the future drive up the prices of consumer goods, making it difficult for people to afford things they need or want. During the First World War, the federal government intervened in private industry to support war needs and exert some control over supply and demand dynamics. Agencies were created to oversee the production of war goods, food, fuel, and non-military ships. Even though the government tried to impose some level of price control in the food and fuel industries, inflation still occurred. According to the US Census Bureau, the prices for many consumer goods nearly doubled between 1915 and 1920. So we see that the average for many consumer goods nearly doubled between 1915 and 1920. The average annual inflation rate also has grown from 1914 through 1924. The inflation rate was unusually high in the period from 1916 through 1920, peaking at 18% in 1918. Wartime inflation was particularly hard on non-working citizens, such as the elderly and sick, because there were no large government programs in place at that time to assist the people in need. A lasting legacy of the First World War was the assumption of large amounts of debt by the federal government to fund the war effort. There were enormous differences between government revenues and spending during the war years. In 1919, government spending peaked at nearly $18.5 billion. Revenues for that year were just over $5 billion. The government made up the difference by borrowing money. One method that was used at that time was the selling of the so-called Liberty bonds. Bonds are a type of a financial asset, basically an IOU, that promises to pay back at some future date the original purchase price plus interest. The Roaring Twenties began with a whimper. There was a severe economic downturn in 1921. However, this crisis was followed by several years of robust economic growth. Mass production and the availability of electricity led to huge consumer demand for household appliances. Installment plans became a popular means for middle-class Americans to purchase expensive, long-lasting goods such as refrigerators, washing machines, and automobiles. Americans also began spending more money on entertainment. They bought radios and went into large numbers to see motion pictures and baseball games. For many people, the automobile became a necessity rather than a luxury. Booming car sales boosted the petroleum and housing markets and allowed city dwellers to move to the suburbs. The prosperity of the 1920s was not shared by all Americans. During the First World War, demand for agricultural goods had skyrocketed, particularly in Europe. Over-optimistic farmers borrowed heavily to pay for tractors and other farm equipment, only to see food prices plummet during the 1920s, when supply outpaced demand. So financial problems in the agricultural industry directly affected many Americans. In addition, banks in rural areas were stressed by farmers who were unable to pay back loans. The agricultural crisis was accompanied by downturns in the coal mining and railroad industries that affected many workers. In the late 1920s, the stock market became a major factor in the US economy. Investors were richly rewarded as stocks increased dramatically in value. Many people took out loans from banks to pay for stock or purchased stock by buying on margin. In this arrangement, an investor would make a small down payment, as little as 10%, on a stock purchase. The remainder of the balance would be paid, in theory, by the future increase in the stock value. Buying on margin was widely practiced by optimistic investors of that time. In The Crash and the Great Depression, a book written by Stanley Schultz and William Tischler from the University of Wisconsin, so they state that by 1929, much of the money that was invested in the stock market did not actually exist. On the 29th of October, 1929, the stock market crashed. For months, President Herbert Hoover and other influential people had warned that there was too much speculation in the stock market and that stock prices were higher than the actual worth of the companies. So in the fall of 1929, investors began to get nervous. On the 24th of October, 1929, there was a selling frenzy as people tried to get rid of stocks that they thought might be overvalued. That day was dubbed as Black Thursday. The following day, the market rebounded somewhat, and stock prices climbed back upward. However, this recovery was short-lived. And already on Tuesday, the 29th of October 1929, panic selling took place all day. Stock values dropped dramatically. The drawback to buying on margin was that if a stock value went down by a certain amount, the lender would make a margin call by asking the buyer for more cash up front. If the margin buyer could not pay, the lender sold the stock to recoup the money. As Black Tuesday progressed, desperate margin buyers paid lenders all their cash in savings in hopes of saving their stock for the expected recovery. But no recovery came. As stock values fell further, lenders demanded more money. By the end of the day, many margin buyers had lost their life savings and their stock. Those who managed to hold on to their stock found it was worth only a fraction of its former value. So according to Harold Bierman Jr. of Cornell University, the US stock market lost 90% of its value between 1929 and 1932. The US economy suffered a devastating downturn following the stock market crash. The depression was so deep and lasted so long, more than a decade, that it is called the Great Depression. Historically, economic depressions had been short downturns with limited consequences. They were temporary dips in an overall trend of American prosperity. But the Great Depression was a completely different experience. It brought long-term unemployment and hardship to millions of people. The unemployment rate soared from 3.2% in 1929 to nearly 25% in 1933. It remained more than 10% through the end of the 1930s. The public lost confidence in the stock market, the banking system, and big businesses. Like all previous depressions, this one included a downward cycle in which businesses reduced spending and production and laid off employees. Unemployed workers, and those fearful of losing their jobs cut back on spending, which forced businesses to lay off more people. The economy underwent deflation, a condition where a lack of money among consumers depresses demand and pushes prices downward. Lower prices for agricultural and industrial goods hurt farmers and businesses, particularly those with high debt. Consumers also had assumed high levels of debt during the 1920s. The Great Depression was aggravated by a crisis in the banking industry. Some banks had invested heavily in the stock market, using their depositors' money or loaned large amounts of money to stock market investors. These banks failed after the crash, and the depositors lost their savings. Fear of further failures caused the so-called bank runs, in which large numbers of depositors rushed to banks to withdraw their money at the same time. This caused more bank failures, which perpetuated the cycle. In addition, some economists believe that the banking market became oversaturated during the 1920s with underfunded and loosely regulated banks that loaned money too easily. These institutions were already financially troubled before the crash, so they could not survive the stress. The United States Great Depression was felt worldwide, particularly in other industrialized countries. By the 1920s, the United States played a major role in world commerce by exporting and importing large amounts of goods and investing money in foreign businesses. A prolonged downturn in U.S. production, spending, and investing, combined with the banking crisis, had international consequences. Europe, in particular, suffered financially as it struggled to recover from the devastation of the First World War. When the Great Depression began, the laissez-faire attitude still dominated political opinion. Some economists, including Andrew Mellon, who served as the Secretary of the Treasury from 1921 through 1932, advised President Hoover not to interfere. Mellon took the traditional viewpoint that supply and demand factors would eventually equilibrate and that the economy would recover on its own. Hoover was not convinced. He tried a variety of tax adjustments, asked industry not to cut wages, and pushed for public work projects. However, the depression only deepened. So in 1932, Americans were ready for a change in leadership. Franklin Roosevelt, the governor of New York, promised a New Deal for the nation. He was elected in a landslide victory and developed a government that aggressively acted in economic affairs. The New Deal included a wide variety of programs intended to bring relief to suffering Americans, to revive farming and business, and to reform the stock market and banking industry. After more than 70 years, economists still argue about whether the New Deal was actually a good deal for the nation. They all agree, however, that it was a turning point in the US economic history. Some New Deal programs did not survive court challenges. The National Industry Recovery Act of 1933 encouraged companies within industries to form alliances and set prices and wages. The companies that participated were exempt from antitrust laws that originally would have forbidden such collision. In 1935, the US Supreme Court ruled this law unconstitutional. Another law, the Agricultural Adjustment Act of 1933, paid farmers to reduce production. It was thought that lower supply would raise prices and improve the living conditions of farmers. But in 1936, the Supreme Court invalidated parts of this act. However, the payment of farm subsidies became a permanent component of the US economic policy. The Federal Securities Act of 1933 regulated the selling of investment instruments such as stock to ensure that buyers are better educated about their purchases and to prevent fraudulent practices. Apart from this act, there were other legacies of the New Deal that include, for example, the Glass-Steagall Banking Act of 1933, which separated the commercial and investment banking industries and established the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation to safeguard depositors' money. Another important document is the Securities Exchange Act of 1934, which regulated the stock exchanges and created an agency which is called the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission. The National Labor Relations Act of 1935 guaranteed the right of employees in most private industries to organize, form labor unions, and bargain collectively with their employers, and it also established the National Labor Relations Board. The Social Security Act of 1935 established a program to provide federal benefits to the elderly and assist the states in providing for aged persons, blind persons, dependent and crippled children, maternal and child welfare, public health, and the administration of their unemployment compensation laws. So government employment programs under the Public Works Administration and the Works Project Administration put people to work building roads, dams, bridges, airfields, and post offices and developing national parks for tourism. As many as 10 to 12 million Americans were employed in these programs at various times during the 1930s. Perhaps the largest legacy of Roosevelt's New Deal was the new role of the federal government as a manipulator of economic forces and a provider of benefits to the needy. This change in US policy was seen as a wise and compassionate move by some people and as a dangerous shift towards socialism by others. In US history, the New Deal is considered the birth of big government. By 1940, the unemployment rate was 19.4%. Even though the rate was down from a peak of 25% in 1933, it was still very high by historical standards. Nearly a decade of New Deal programs had softened the hardship suffered by many Americans, but had not boosted the country out of the Great Depression. It was going to take a war to accomplish this task. Even though the United States officially entered the Second World War in 1941, it had been gearing up its industries for war for more than a year. This experience at mobilization, which means converting civilian industries to produce military goods, proved to be invaluable. The federal government established a host of agencies to oversee wartime production, labor relations, and prices. Efforts were made to avoid the huge inflation increase that had occurred during the First World War. Rationing, including tight controls over how much of an item a person can use or consume in a certain amount of time, was instituted on some goods to prevent dramatic price increases. Overall, these efforts were successful. Inflation spiked during the early years of the war and immediately after, but was not consistently high over the decade. Businesses rushed to increase production and hire workers to produce the goods needed for the war effort. Unemployment dropped dramatically, and wages went up, particularly for workers in low-skilled factory jobs. Laborers found themselves in high demand and joined labor unions in record numbers to consolidate their power and seek better working conditions. World War II was an expensive endeavor for the United States. However, it was believed that the stakes were so high that the war had to be won at any cost. Government spending during the war far outpaced revenues. By 1945, the government was spending around $90 billion per year and taking in revenues about half this amount. Once again, the difference was made up by borrowing. The Great Depression shook many people's beliefs in the laissez-faire approach to economics advocated by Adam Smith in the 18th century. During the 1930s and 1940s, different approaches to capitalism began to receive serious attention. One of the most famous economists of that time was John Maynard Keynes. Keynes was an English expert in the application of economic theory to real-world problems. He published several influential books, including The Economic Consequences of the Peace and The General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money. In the latter book, Keynes advocated strong government intervention in the economy as a remedy for the ongoing economic depression. Politicians of the 1930s were not completely convinced by Keynes' arguments, particularly in regards to government spending. Maintaining a balanced federal budget was considered so sacred that the governments of Hoover and later Roosevelt were reluctant to shift away from this precedent. However, following World War II, it appeared obvious that huge government spending had helped boost recovery from the Great Depression. So Keynes' theories on capitalism, unemployment, and business cycles became highly regarded, and he is credited with inventing macroeconomics. So this is a big picture approach that measures broad trends in an economy, such as employment and inflation, and the way these trends interact. In contrast, microeconomics analyzes the economy on a smaller scale, for example by studying the supply and demand factors at work in individual markets or industrial segments. So Keynesian economics became the operating principle of the US government in the post-World War II era. Even though Keynes had his critics and his methods have been revised over time, still he is considered by many to be the father of the mixed economy system used in the United States to this day. One innovation of the 1940s was the National Income and Product Accounts, which are compilations of national economic data. Before that time, there was a lack of comprehensive macroeconomic data on the nation's inputs and outputs, such as labor and production of goods and services. This problem became apparent during the Great Depression, when the Hoover and then Roosevelt administrations were forced to make decisions based on fragmented and incomplete data on the nation's financial condition. As a result, the federal government asked researchers at the National Bureau of Economic Research at the University of New York to begin estimating national income, including wages, profits, and rent. The NBER had been founded in 1920 as a private, non-profit organization dedicated to economic research. During the Second World War, the federal government began compiling another macroeconomic measure called the Gross National Product, the GNP. The GNP is the amount in dollars of the value of financial goods and services produced by Americans over a particular time period. For example, the Census Bureau reports that the GNP in 1945 was nearly $212 billion. At least that was the figure officially stated in 1946, a year later. The GNP is calculated by summing consumer and government spending, business and residential investments, and the net value of US exports, which is exports minus imports. At first, GNP estimates were made annually. Eventually, they were calculated on a quarterly basis. The GNP provides a valuable tool for tracking national productivity over time. By the end of the 1940s, an entire set of NIPAs had been developed to report macroeconomic data on the state of the US economy. Following the Second World War, many US industries demobilized from producing military goods and returned to producing consumer goods. Well-paid workers who had been frustrated by wartime shortages were ready to spend money. Returning soldiers received government incentives to buy houses and start businesses. Post-war euphoria drove a spending spree and a baby boom. New industries in aviation and electronics arose after the Second World War. Many existing industries underwent consolidation and growth as corporations merged into giant conglomerates. The 1950s also experienced a boom in business franchises. In this agreement, an individual could purchase permission from a company in one geographic area to sell the company's products or services in another area. Franchising proved to be an extremely effective means of spreading brand recognition and was widely practiced in the surging fast food industry. In 1955, Des Plaines, Illinois, became the site of the first McDonald's franchise, after the businessman Ray Kroc became a franchisee for the McDonald's brothers, who owned a small chain of restaurants in California. By 1959, there were more than 100 McDonald's franchises around the country. Over the next decade, franchising was practiced in a number of other businesses, many of which grew into major corporations. Dwight Eisenhower was president from 1953 through 1961. His administration is associated with a growing economy that experienced low inflation rates and general prosperity. However, the prosperity of the 1950s was not shared equally in American society. Once again, farmers found themselves in trouble due to overproduction. An oversupply of agricultural goods meant lower prices and lower profits. Agriculture became increasingly an industry in which large factory farms run by corporations were able to survive, while many smaller farmers could not compete. Minority populations, largely African Americans, also suffered financial hardships during this time. There was a dramatic difference between the unemployment rates for whites and minorities during the post-war decades. By the mid-1950s, unemployment among minorities was twice as high as it was among white workers, a disparity that lingered well into the 1960s. It was in this atmosphere that the civil rights movement gained in strength and urgency. In 1954, segregation was ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. A year later, the African-American seamstress and activist Rosa Parks was arrested in Alabama for refusing to move from the white section of a public bus. This incident spurred a bus boycott and ultimately brought Martin Luther King Jr. and other leaders of the movement to national prominence. The United States left the Second World War in sound economic shape. During the war, all other industrialized nations had suffered great losses in their infrastructure, financial stability, and populations. The United States invested heavily in the post-war economies of Western Europe and Japan, hoping to instill an atmosphere conducive to peace and the spread of capitalism. U.S. barriers to foreign trade were relaxed to build new markets for U.S. exports and to allow some war-ravaged nations to make money selling goods to American consumers. The Soviet Union had been a wartime ally of the United States, but relations became strained after the war. The Soviet Union had adopted communism, following a period of revolution and civil war in the late 1910s and early 1920s. During the Second World War, the Soviet Union liberated a large part of Eastern Europe from Nazi occupation. Through various means, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR, assumed political control over these nations. The USSR had been largely industrialized before the Second World War and quickly regained its industrial capabilities. It soon took a major role in international affairs, placing it in direct conflict with the only other superpower of that time, the United States. So a Cold War began between the two rich and powerful nations that had completely different political, economic, and social goals for the world. The Cold War was fought mostly by politicians and diplomats, a direct and large-scale military conflict between US and Soviet forces never occurred. Regardless, an expansive arms race began in which both sides produced and stockpiled large amounts of weapons as a show of force to deter a first strike by the enemy. In addition, both sides provided financial and military support to countries around the world in an attempt to influence the political leanings of those populations. Communist China joined the Cold War during the 1950s and often partnered with the USSR against USA. During the early 1950s, US forces became embroiled in two Asian conflicts over communism, the Korean War and the Vietnam War. The Korean War was relatively short, lasting from 1950 through 1953. The fight in Vietnam turned out to be a long and difficult one in which US forces, assisted by a handful of other countries, were pitted against highly motivated forces equipped and backed by the USSR and China. The United States was engaged in the Vietnam War from 1955 until it withdrew the last of its troops in 1975, leaving South Vietnam to a communist takeover. In Outline of the U.S. History, Alfonso Hamby from Ohio University states that the total cost of the Vietnam War exceeded $150 billion. In both the Korean and Vietnam Wars, the United States chose to fight in a limited manner without using its arsenal of nuclear weapons or engaging Chinese or Soviet troops directly for fear of sparking another world war. Full-scale mobilization of US industries was not required for these wars, as it had been during the Second World War. Instead, a defense industry developed during the Cold War to supply the US military on a continuous basis with the arms and goods it needed. Spending on national defense soared during the Second World War and then declined dramatically following the war's end. However, military spending quickly climbed again as the Cold War heated up, remaining above 40% for nearly 2 decades. The nation's central bank, the Federal Reserve System, was formed in 1913 to furnish currency and supervise financial institutions. Gradually, it took on other roles that affected the amount of money circulating in the United States and the interest rates charged by banks to their customers. The Federal Reserve System consists of 12 regional banks located around the country and is overseen by a 7-member Board of Governors headquartered in Washington, D.C. The Fed, as it came to be called, was designed to be as independent as possible from political pressures from the US President and the Congress. This safeguard was included to prevent the Fed from having to bow to demands for short-term economic fixes requested by politicians seeking re-election. The Fed was charged with taking a big picture, long-term approach to economic policy for the good of the nation as a whole. From its inception until the early 1950s, the Fed was influenced by the policies of the U.S. Department of the Treasury, a federal agency created back in 1789. So during the late 1940s, the Fed and the Treasury officials disagreed about how best to handle the large debt accumulated by the United States during the Second World War. This conflict and other contentious issues led to a new agreement, or accord, between the two agencies about the roles of each in the U.S. economy. This accord is considered the birth of the modern Fed, an organization that has grown to exert great power in the U.S. economy. The The chairman of the Board of Governors at that time was William McChesney Martin Jr. Martin was a dynamic leader who maintained his post for nearly 2 decades. Under his leadership, the Fed assumed greater control over the nation's financial policies. This control was exercised primarily by influencing interest rates on loans. Lowering interest rates encouraged borrowing, which put more money into circulation for spending or investing. However, if demand outpaced supply, price inflation became a problem. Then, the Fed would raise interest rates to make borrowing less attractive and dampen demand. Martin reportedly summed this up by saying, "You have to take away the punch bowl when the party is warming up." His policy proved to be fruitful during the prosperous decades of the 1950s and 1960s. The 1960s were a time of social and economic change for the United States. The decade began with the election of President John Kennedy, who promised to ensure economic growth and address growing social problems within the United States. In 1963, Kennedy's efforts were cut short by his assassination. Lyndon Johnson took over as president and dramatically enlarged the federal government and its role in socio-economic affairs. Johnson's administration initiated large-scale programs for the needy, including the healthcare programs Medicare for the elderly and Medicaid for the poor, as well as jobs programs, federal aid to schools, and food stamps for low-income Americans. The so-called War on Poverty and the escalating war in Vietnam proved to be extremely expensive. At the same time, the United States was pursuing a costly but ultimately successful endeavor to land astronauts on the moon before the end of the decade. Consumer and government spending drove the nation's GNP during the 1960s. It grew to $977 billion by 1970. However, inflation became a problem, as it often goes in a fast-growing economy. So it started in the 1960s, and the macroeconomic level meant that there was too much money in the hands of consumers, which resulted in consumer demand that was higher than supply. The U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics notes that by 1970, the inflation rate had reached 5.7%. The nation was preoccupied with the explosive social problems of that time. During the mid to late 1960s, the country was plagued by protests against the Vietnam War and riots in urban areas populated by poor African Americans. By 1968, there were 500,000 U.S. troops in Vietnam. Nightly television coverage provided a bleak picture of the war's progress and helped turn public opinion against the war and President Johnson. In 1968, Johnson announced he would not seek re-election. The same year, Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy, John Kennedy's brother and an aspiring presidential candidate, were assassinated. So the United States left the 1960s having experienced the longest continuous stretch of positive GNP in history. The first quarter of 1961 through the last quarter of 1969 was a very positive period because GNP was growing. However, high inflation was about to become a major problem. Stagflation is a word coined during the 1970s to describe an economy suffering stagnant growth, high inflation, and high unemployment all at the same time. This combination of economic problems was unprecedented in US history. Previously, high inflation had occurred when the economy was growing quickly, such as during the Second World War. However, high production had meant high employment levels. By contrast, economic downturns were associated with higher unemployment but lower inflation, sometimes even deflation. So these relationships had been considered natural and certain. But the 1970s was a unique period of time because both unemployment and inflation were high by historical standards. Economist Robert Joseph Barrow invented a new term called the misery index to describe this condition. The misery index is computed by summing the unemployment rate and the inflation rate. There were 3 presidents during the 1970s: Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, and Jimmy Carter. Each tried a variety of measures to stem stagflation, but none was considered effective. Nixon implemented wage and price controls and increased government spending. In 1973, he resigned under threat of impeachment for his role in the Watergate scandal. Vice President Gerald Ford assumed the presidency. Economic problems continued, and in 1976, the country elected Jimmy Carter, as the new president. Jimmy Carter had emphasized the high misery index during his presidential campaign, but his administration was unable to turn the tide. By 1980, the misery index in the US climbed to 20%. The United States' economic problems were aggravated by its dependence on foreign oil and competition from foreign industries. In 1973, the Middle Eastern members of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, halted oil exports to the United States in retaliation for US support of Israel. The oil embargo lasted 5 months. When shipments resumed, the price of oil had dramatically increased. Americans faced high prices, long lines, and shortages at the gas pumps. The average price for gasoline surged from around 35 cents per gallon in 1972 to $1.35 per gallon in 1981. To save fuel, a 55 mile per hour speed limit was imposed on the nation's interstates. The federal government called on Americans to conserve energy and provided an example by not lighting the White House Christmas tree. During the late 1970s, a revolution in oil-rich Iran brought a second wave of shortages to US energy supplies. The energy crisis of the 1970s had a ripple effect through the US economy, causing the prices of other goods and services to increase. Lower profits and uncertainty about the future caused businesses to slow down and reduce their workforce. At the same time, US industries in steel, automobiles, and electronics endured stiff foreign competition, particularly from Japan. Small energy-efficient Japanese cars became very popular in the United States. By 1980, gasoline cost more than $1 per gallon, which was quadruple the price in 1970. US car makers struggled to compete, having always relied on consumer demand for large automobiles, which were now considered gas guzzlers. One of the measures that President Carter used to combat stagflation was deregulation. For decades, certain industries in the United States had been given government immunity from market supply and demand factors. The railroad, trucking, and airline industries were prime examples. Companies in these industries were guaranteed rates and routes and were allowed to operate contrary to antitrust laws. In 1978, the airline industry was deregulated. The result was that airlines began to compete with each other over fares and routes, and new companies entered the industry. Some of the large, well-established companies were unable to compete in the new environment and went out of business. However, demand increased as prices came down and flying became available to many more Americans. By 1980, deregulation had been completed or was underway for the railroad, trucking, energy, financial services, and telecommunications industries. In November 1980, the American people elected Ronald Reagan as the new president. Inflation was at 13% that year, which was incredibly high for a peacetime economy. Unemployment was at 7%, meaning that millions of people were unemployed and faced with rapidly increasing prices in the marketplace. The economic situation was poor. The drastic measures were required to turn the economy around. In late 1979, President Carter had appointed a new governor of the Federal Reserve, Paul Volcker. Paul Volcker promised to slay the inflationary dragon, as he put it. Volcker began by tightening the nation's money supply. This had the effect of making credit more difficult to obtain, which drove up interest rates. The government knew that rising interest rates would probably trigger a production slowdown that would push unemployment even higher. It was a trade-off that policymakers during the previous decade had been unwilling to accept. Volcker forged ahead with his policies, and by the early 1980s, interest rates had reached historical highs. The prime loan rate, which is the interest rate that banks charge with their best customers, peaked at 21.5% in December 1890. In 1981, the average interest rate for a conventional 30-year mortgage soared to nearly 18.5%, the highest rate ever recorded by the federal home loan mortgage. The lack of credit caused a business slowdown, a reduction in GNP growth. As expected, the recession put more people out of work. Unemployment climbed at first, averaging 10% in 1982 and 1983, but then began to decline. By the end of the decade, it was down around 5%. The inflation rate dropped from a high of 13.5% in 1980 to 4.8% by 1989. Even though the spike in unemployment had been painful for Americans, the inflationary dragon was finally dead. When Reagan took office in 1981, he brought a new approach to curing the nation's financial woes: supply-side economics. Traditionally, the government had focused on the demand side, the role of consumers in stimulating businesses to produce more. Reagan preferred economic policies that directly helped producers. In supply-side economics, Paul Johnson of Auburn University describes the philosophy this way: supply-side policy analysts focus on barriers to high productivity, identifying ways in which the government can promote faster economic growth over the long haul by removing impediments to the supply of and efficient use of the factors of production. One of the cornerstones of supply-side economics is reducing taxes so that people and businesses have more money to invest in private enterprise. Reagan enacted tax cuts through two pieces of legislation: the Economic Recovery Tax Act of 1981 and the Tax Reform Act of 1986. The result was a much lower number of tax brackets, the various rates at which individuals are taxed based on their income, a broader tax base, wealth within a jurisdiction that is liable to taxation, and reduced tax rates on income and capital gains, the profit made from selling an investment, such as land, for example. At the same time, Reagan pushed for greater national defense spending as part of his peace through strength approach to the Soviet Union and selective cuts in social services spending. However, no cuts were made to the largest and most expensive programs within the social services budget. The combination of all these factors resulted in high federal deficits during the 1980s. In other words, the federal government was spending more than it was making each year. The federal deficits of the mid-1980s were more than twice what they had been during the mid-1970s. The national debt in 1981 reached $1 trillion. The 1990s were a time of phenomenal economic growth for the United States, even amid the shadows of war and an ever-increasing federal deficit. In August 1990, the military forces of Iraq under President Saddam Hussein invaded the small neighboring country of Kuwait. President George Bush had taken office in 1989 and quickly acted to put together a coalition of international forces that successfully forced Iraq out of Kuwait. The Gulf War, as it came to be known, was short-lived and would be seen as a triumph, if complete. Even though his military strength was weakened, Hussein still was not removed from power in Iraq. As a result, he continued to pose foreign relations problems for the United States for many years ahead. President Bush had been elected in large because of his promise not to raise taxes. During his presidential campaign, he famously said, "Read my lips, no new taxes." However, the promise was not one he could keep, given the economic realities of that time. During the late 1980s, there had been a severe financial crisis in the savings and loan industry, which had been recently deregulated. A series of unwise loans and poor business decisions left most of the industry in shambles and necessitated a government bailout. By 1993, the cost of the bailout had reached nearly $525 billion. At the same time, the government faced rapidly rising expenditures on healthcare programs for the elderly and the needy. Bush reluctantly agreed to a tax increase, a move that was politically damaging. In 1992, he lost his re-election bid to the Arkansas governor Bill Clinton, who was re-elected in 1996. Overall, the 1990s were a period of peace and prosperity for the United States. The Cold War ended when the Soviet Union disintegrated into individual republics. Technological innovations, particularly in the computer industry, helped push the economy to new heights. Sterling business success led to robust investor confidence in the stock markets. Even though real estate was the preferred investment through nearly all of this period, the 1990s witnessed tremendous increases in the holdings of corporate equity by the average American. In the mid-1980s, the average household had only 10% of its assets in corporate equity. By 1998, this percentage had reached nearly 30%, roughly equal to the percent held in real estate. The Dow Jones Industrial Average is a stock market index, a measure used by economists to gauge the value of the stock of 30 large companies. Between the late 1970s and the late 1990s, the index soared from around 1,000 points to 11,000 points, reflecting the tremendous value gained by these companies over this period. The combination of low interest rates, low unemployment, and high investment rates and business growth combined to greatly expand the US economy. The chair of the Federal Reserve Board at that time described this expansion as America's sparkling economic performance. The first decade of the 21st century has been a tumultuous one for the US economy. During the early 200s, the United States endured the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks, the outbreak of wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, corporate scandals, devastating hurricanes, and a slump in the stock market. Nevertheless, the economy remained robust, as evidenced by healthy growth in the gross domestic product. The unemployment rates were relatively low, and the inflation rates were moderately high. Around 2005, the economy began showing signs of stress. Growth in the gross domestic product slowed, and unemployment and inflation rates started creeping upward. The housing market took a nosedive, and the US dollar lost strength against international currencies. As of July 2008, investors and consumers nervously watched economic indicators amid speculation that a recession could be imminent. In January 2001, George Bush was inaugurated as the nation's new president. He entered the executive office with plans to overhaul many federal programs and enacted a tax cut within his first few months of being in office. On September 11, 2001, 4 commercial airlines were commandeered by hijackers, and the attacks killed more than 2,900 people and stunned the world. The so-called 9/11 attacks dramatically altered the priorities of the US government. So the United States went to war first in Afghanistan in 2001 and then in Iraq in 2003. Even though the military campaigns were technically successful, US military forces were unable to bring stability to these troubled nations. In June 2008, the Afghanistan and Iraq campaigns had cost the United States over $828 billion. During the late 1990s, the stock market witnessed tremendous growth, driven in large part by investor enthusiasm for Internet-related businesses. Access to the Internet became widespread in the United States and much of the developed world, creating many new market opportunities for entrepreneurs. Investors enthusiastically poured money into the stock of these new businesses. The National Association of Securities Dealers Automated Quotation System, shortly Nasdaq, is a US-based stock market on which the stock of many technology companies is traded. The Nasdaq Composite Index is a measure of the performance of many of the stocks on Nasdaq. In 1990, the index was less than 500. In early 2000, it peaked above 4,000 during the height of the Internet stock craze. Many of the stocks had been overvalued. Their high prices could not be sustained based on the actual financial results that the companies were producing. What followed was a sharp market correction as investors sold off many Internet-based stocks and the prices plummeted. By late 2002, the Nasdaq Composite Index was around 1,200, from which it slowly began to climb again. In economics, a bubble is a phenomenon in which investors invest a lot in a particular commodity or market sector that becomes overvalued. Excitement about positive gains overrules frank analysis of the underlying financial factors. Unfortunately, the very existence of a bubble is not evident until after the fact, when the bubble has burst and much value has been lost in the investments and the businesses involved. During the middle of the decade, another bubble burst. This one was the US housing market. Its collapse had serious and far-reaching consequences on the US economy as a whole. The United States experienced historically low interest rates during the early 2000s. This spurred demand throughout the housing industry. Rising demand pushed prices upward. Homes in many areas of the country began to appreciate, which means to rise in value, at an unprecedented rate. Investors eagerly bought houses and sold them a short time later for more money. Many banks and financial institutions became caught up in the frenzy and lowered their normally strict loan standards. They introduced new types of mortgages, in which payments were low at first and then quickly rose over a certain period. Eager home buyers, especially first-time buyers, entered into these agreements without adequately considering the consequences to their personal finances. In late 2005 and early 2006, the housing bubble burst. Over-speculation had pushed home prices above sustainable levels. Demand suddenly plummeted, and homes depreciated in many areas of the country. Some mortgage holders defaulted on their loans, putting extreme pressure on mortgage lenders. The house market collapse put an enormous strain on the overall economy. As of July 2008, many analysts believed the full effects from the collapse had not been completely realized and would continue to plague the economy for several years to come. The economy of the United States today is a highly developed free market economy. It is the world's largest economy by nominal GDP and net wealth, and the second largest by purchasing power parity. It has the world's fifth highest per capita GDP and the seventh highest per capita GDP in 2021. The United States has the most technologically powerful and innovative economy in the world. Its firms are at or near the forefront in technological advances, especially in artificial intelligence, computers, pharmaceuticals, medical, aerospace, and military equipment. The US dollar is the currency most used in international transactions and is the world's foremost reserve currency, backed by its economy, military, the petrodollar system, and its linked euro-dollar and large US treasuries market. Several countries use it as their official currency, and in others, it is the de facto currency. The largest US trading partners include China, the European Union, Canada, Mexico, India, Japan, South Korea, the United Kingdom, and Taiwan. The US is the world's largest importer and the second largest exporter. It has free trade agreements with several countries, including the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, Australia, South Korea, Israel, and several others that are in effect or under negotiation. The nation's economy is fueled by abundant natural resources, a well-developed infrastructure, and high productivity. It has the seventh highest total estimated value of natural resources, valued at $45 trillion in 2015. Americans have the highest average household and employee income among OECD member states. The New York Stock Exchange and Nasdaq are the world's largest stock exchanges by market capitalization and trade volume. Foreign investments made in the US total almost $4 trillion, while American investments in foreign countries total over $5.6 trillion. The US economy is ranked first in international rankings on venture capital and global research and development funding. Consumer spending comprised 68% of the US economy in 2018, while its labor share of income was 43% in 2017. The US has the world's largest consumer market. The nation's labor market has attracted immigrants from all over the world, and its net migration rate is among the highest in the world. This is it. Thank you for attention, and goodbye.